Hello and welcome to One Crown Office Row. My name is Joseph Doherty and today the student lawyer is here with Adam Wagner, a barrister here at One Crown Office Row. The set is a top barristers' chambers in London and Adam specialises in public law, human rights and general civil law. He's well known for his human rights advocacy work. Indeed, last year at the Liberty Awards he was shortlisted for Human Rights Lawyer of the Year, and he set up the UK Human Rights blog in 2010 and subsequently Rights Info, another website, last year. Adam, to kick us off, could you give us an overview of the work you do as a barrister?
Yeah, as you said, I practice mainly in human rights and public law, so I deal with cases involving people's rights from across the spectrum, usually including either prisons, asylum and immigration, or other areas like inquests, public inquiries. I do public law and human rights almost all of my practice. I also do little bits of general civil law as well.
Okay, and what would you say a typical week would be like for you?
I really don't have a typical week.
Okay.
One of the features of my the way that my career has gone is I do quite a few different things and wear different hats in a standard week. So I'm often in court. That's a pretty much a constant. In a given week, I'll be in court at least once.
Okay.
Usually in London. Usually in a public law case, so in the administrative court, which is across the road from Chambers. But equally, I was in Sheffield a couple of weeks ago for a week. In the earlier parts of my career, particularly, I went all around the country. On top of that, I do quite a lot of advisory work, so I'll be set either at my desk in Chambers or at home doing that. But then, wearing different hats, I also direct a project called Rights Info, which we'll talk about, which is a charity which increases support for human rights through public education.
And would you say when you are in court, you tend to represent the state or private parties?
I do about 50-50,
okay.
Actually. In my public law and human rights work, it's about 50-50, and that will vary in different parts of the year, sometimes slightly more on the side of the state, sometimes slightly more for claimants.
Okay. Many of our viewers today will be thinking about a career in law, maybe as a solicitor, maybe as a barrister. How was it that you decided you wanted to be a barrister?
I decided after I'd finished university and actually went to study in the States. I decided during that year that I wanted to do something which was involved public affairs, if I put it like that, but not necessarily academia or directly politics. I found human rights as a topic really interesting, and I thought the idea of public law generally was a really interesting way of being intellectually challenged, but also doing a career where I could make enough money to live in London and also have a varied working life. I also like the idea of being self-employed because, as you can probably see from the other stuff that I do, I'm quite entrepreneurial. I like to try different things.
Okay, brilliant. And again, our viewers who are aspiring barristers, do you have any specific advice for them in their quest to become barristers?
I think it's a really, really difficult route to take, and I don't want to put people off generally, because they'll be told a lot particularly when you're studying, that this is very difficult. But it really is. There's very few jobs. There's even fewer pupilages than when I applied close to 10 years ago, particularly in public law. In the public law work, because a lot of the funding's gone out of it for legal aid. That's the sort of the bad news. The good news is that if you have the right qualifications, if you're intellectually of a high enough caliber, because you need to be fairly smart to get into the job, although you don't need to be a genius. If you've got determination, if you're able to put yourself in front of people, do well at interviews and do well in court, then there is there is a decent career out there for you.
Fantastic. So that was the first half of the interview, looking at Adam's work as a barrister. We're now going to talk about Adam's work as an advocate for human rights. So, as I said at the beginning, Adam set up the UK Human Rights blog in 2010, and then last year set up another website called Rights Info. Adam, what was the idea behind setting up these two websites?
Well, when I started practice, so in 2009, after I got taken on as a tenant in this chambers, I saw that there were other legal blogs emerging, and blogging was still quite sort of in its early stages, or at least in a way which anybody could access. So WordPress was available at that stage, so you could set a blog up really straightforwardly. I'm quite a techie, and I've always liked to play around with websites and that sort of thing. I've done a bit of design. So I set up a dummy blog just as an idea that maybe we should do it as a chambers, and then we sort of played around with it for a bit and took it to the chambers meeting, where I think most people didn't know who I was yet, and said, other people are doing it, we could do this, it'd be a worthwhile thing for chambers, it won't cost anything, because it didn't cost anything, and it never really cost anything, and we started doing it. And that's really the trick of any kind of blog. You've got to start doing it and see if it works, and then that became really successful really quite quickly, because there was nothing else out there from a not quite lay perspective, but if you have judgments and then legal journals, they're all written in quite a sort of impenetrable style. There wasn't really anything there that was explaining human rights judgments from an expert perspective, but for a non-expert audience, for an interested audience. And newspapers weren't doing a very good job, so we stepped into that vacuum and became very popular.
And you say that UK Human Rights blog, not for an expert audience. Rights Info, if you go onto the site, it's very colourful. There's a lot of social media integrated into the site. Was that intended for an even wider audience?
Yeah, I mean, Rights Info was something I've been thinking about for a while. How do you do this? How do you carry on this project of opening up human rights law, sort of democratising it, stopping it being an elite exercise, or just one that's only really open for lawyers? Because human rights are for everyone and they're important to everybody. How can you do that from using modern technology, using social media, which is the sort of incredibly powerful publishing medium, which is only really just beginning? So a couple of years ago, I got a bit of funding to set that up and to get proper designers in, and I built a team of volunteers and a few staff to build it, and it's gone really well. It's really popular. We've won awards. It's been absolutely fascinating journey so far over the last year and a half since its launch.
Okay, moving into the slightly more meaty questions. It's my understanding that the language of human rights has been around for about 70 years. So we had the Second World War, where there were these terrible atrocities committed, and human rights was something of a response to that war. And yet, since 1945, the atrocities have continued. There's been more war, more genocide, more indifference to human dignity or human indignity. Do you think that the concept of human rights has been a useful one?
It's always difficult to separate out causes and effect, but from a European perspective, where the World War II was really a European war which took over the whole world, and since 1945 we haven't really had any European wars of the type that we used to have regularly. These are extremely destructive, every sort of 20 year or so, fights between European states, and I don't think human rights are the only reason for that. But we've had since 1953 an enforceable human rights convention, which was meant to act as an early warning system for real human rights abuses, designed by people who really knew what what it looked like when rights were trampled by either by fascists or by the communists. And I think that, in conjunction with the just rising living standards, but also international cooperative organisations like the EU, have really created an environment of peace rather than war. And I think we'll never know for sure what would have happened without those, but it does look like, if you just look at Europe, that's been pretty successful. Across the world, obviously, I'm a strong believer that if you put human rights ideas as the central plank of any society, and they really are taken notice of, and they're enforceable, and every bit of the state is infused with them, then I think that's a really good way of preventing wars and of preventing atrocities and preventing abuses of citizens' rights. Obviously, places like Syria, African states, where there have been really serious conflicts, are not rights protecting or rights respecting states. I think that's the connection.
So you mentioned there Syria, African states, which leads nicely on to what you think the greatest challenges are for human rights at the moment.
Well, I think in the UK, where we have a very strong culture of rights protection, and one which we can be really proud of, that precedes human rights laws, but is definitely strengthened by those laws as well. I think in the UK, the big challenge is this ebbing away at the belief in international institutions, in the belief of rights as a framework which is good for people rather than bad for people, attacks on human rights laws and conventions and international treaties. I think all of those elements are corrosive on the future rights of people in the UK. And I think worldwide we can see similar trends across the liberal, the democratic states, populism, sort of anti-idealistic ways of looking at the world. I think that's really damaging, and I think it damages the rest of the world because it makes us less willing to step in and stand up for our values elsewhere if we haven't got the confidence to do it at home.
So, speaking of the UK being willing to stand up for our values for human rights, the Conservative Party in their manifesto in 2010 and again in 2015 promised to repeal the Human Rights Act, which was brought in by Tony Blair in 2000, and replace it with a British Bill of Rights. What's your view on this proposal?
Well, I mean, that proposal has now been over 10 years old. It was announced in 2006, and we still have never seen the actual proposal. And it's really been overtaken, I think, by Brexit. I'd be really surprised if we see anything. I mean, I haven't heard any whisper at all of a Bill of Rights since the Brexit vote, except the Justice Secretary saying, "Oh yeah, we're still working on it and we're still doing it." It's very hard to say what impact that will have. If it's just a rebranding exercise, it will have no impact at all, except it will call the Human Rights Act something else. I think the likelihood is it will be, by the time it gets out finally from under the desk of the Justice Secretary, it will look like a probably quite unwieldy sort of smorgasbord of different beefs that people have with the Human Rights Act, whether it's the application to soldiers abroad or the issues it creates around deporting people to face torture. And it will, who knows? I think it will end up being quite an ugly document because it's not really, doesn't really look like anybody's thinking, how can we make these human rights better? How can we make protections stronger? They're really thinking about, well, how can we stop the Daily Mail complaining about the Human Rights Act, which will never happen.
You've touched on it there, but I'll dig in a little bit anyway. Many of our viewers will have heard about the case of the Crown and Jogi earlier in this year, where the Supreme Court said that the courts have been misinterpreting the law on joint enterprise for a number of decades. Now, you presented oral arguments in that case in the Supreme Court regarding Article 7 of the European Convention on Human Rights, this no punishment without law principle. Do you think that repealing the Human Rights Act would have any impact on the English court's regards for the kinds of arguments you made there?
Well, if we repeal the Human Rights Act, put nothing in its place, then you wouldn't be able to make those arguments anymore, and that would be a huge impact. We'd go back to the pre-2000 position where you'd have to say, well, look at these international courts, isn't it interesting what they're saying? And the courts will say, oh yes, that is very interesting, but we don't have to, there's no reason for us to follow it. It could, I mean, it really, the devil's in the detail, and it really depends on what changes. But already you can see, particularly the Supreme Court is building itself up towards the position where we don't have human rights laws in our domestic law. And you see it over and over again over the last couple of years where the court has said, well, human rights, that's very interesting, but what about the common law? Can't we go back to the common law? So there was a case called Osborne about all hearings in front of the parole board. There's been loads of other cases where they've tried to bolster the common law, really because I think the court are worried that they might be left, if they create this or they build on this human rights architecture, what happens if the foundations are taken away? They'll be left having to redo all the law according to the common law. So that's where they're going, but I don't think it's a particularly coherent approach, because the common law is nowhere near as clear on certain rights as human rights law is. It's all right probably for freedom of expression. Article 7 is a good example which is no punishment without law, and we were talking about the clarity of law, because Article 7 really arises from a British common law right, so an English and Welsh common law right, going back centuries and centuries. We used our main argument was on the common law. But there are other rights, like the right to privacy, which really don't have a common law basis and would be significantly affected by taking away those foundations of human rights law.
Okay, excellent. The final question I have then is, in light of everything we've discussed, can we afford to be optimistic about the future of human rights?
I think we can definitely be optimistic. I'm personally very optimistic, mainly because if you look at the trajectory overall and you try and avoid thinking about the peaks and troughs that we go through day to day, in 1945 really human rights were not on the horizon, and the European Court, the European Convention, which was launched in 1953, the court only became full-time in 1998 and is now protecting over 800 million people and producing thousands of judgments every year. That's a really quick development, and it's a really amazing institution if you look at it fairly. Equally, the Human Rights Act, 16 years ago, we had no domestic human rights protections. No judge in the UK had ever judged in a UK court on a human rights case, and now 16 years later we have thousands of human rights judgments across the whole spectrum of social issues, which have really added to our society. So, whether it's the victims of rape, forcing police to investigate their allegations, or people who have experienced child abuse being able to get justice against social workers, which purely did not happen before human rights laws came into our law. The rights of journalists to protect their sources, the rights of soldiers to serve in the army even though they're gay. All these developments that have come directly from human rights law. We had the other day the Turing law, which is eventually going to go through Parliament, about pardoning men who were convicted under unjust anti-homosexuality laws for decades. the only reason that those laws were stamped out across the whole UK was a human rights judgment. And I think these are all really big wins that people don't know very much about, but are there, and which is what Rights Info is trying to do, is kind of celebrate and create an environment where we can celebrate rather than moan about human rights laws.
Brilliant. Well, I would absolutely encourage any of our viewers to go to the UK human rights blog Rights Info to read more about human rights, because these are very important issues. Adam Wagner, thank you very much for joining the Student Lawyer today, and thank you to our viewers at home. Thank you.
Thanks very much for having me.